Nobody noticed him, until a little girl tapped 5 times against the woman's coat, and the janitor who swept the mall's invisible aisle remembered a lesson he'd taught his daughter and refused to look away. The Riverside Mall on a frosty November afternoon felt like a scene painted in comfort. Holiday lights looped along the railings, a recorded choir drifted from the speakers, families tugged last-minute lists from pockets, and a child's sticky juice puddle glinted near the fountain. Thomas Miller moved through it all with a yellow mop and a cart of supplies. He was part of the scenery, a regular background presence people barely registered. His uniform hung loose now, too many launders and too tight pay. The name tag said Tom. No one called him Thomas. No one stepped aside when he walked because there was nothing to step aside for. He was simply another quiet worker keeping the floor from becoming somebody's next accident. He liked being quiet most days. It made the world less brittle for him and for Emma. He could be the steady presence his daughter needed without drawing attention to the fissures that ran deep at home. The unpaid bills stacked like small, angry mountains on the kitchen table. The evenings when the refrigerator hummed too loud and he pretended the sound was company. The voicemail from the agency that said, again, no openings for full-time cleaning crews beyond the weekend float. He had been a carpenter once, then a husband, then a man whose partner left one morning with 2 suitcases and a note that tried to explain why 7 years was suddenly not enough. The work under fluorescent lights kept them fed. It also kept Thomas anonymous in a way that hurt and, oddly, protected. He wiped a coffee ring from a bench and watched a toddler chase a balloon. Emma was at school, a figure on the other side of his day. Homework papers in her backpack, a stuffed bear with one button eye, a small, imperfect grin she drew with purple crayon and taped to the refrigerator. In the mornings, he added a dot of syrup to her pancakes and practiced saying, "We got this," in the mirror until the words tasted real. He taught her the silent signal on a night when she asked if Daddy would always be there. He showed her the hand gesture, how to raise a hand in front of you, palm facing inward, as if holding something precious to your chest, and the 5 small taps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, done against the breastbone, like a knock at the heart. He explained it plainly. Use it if you cannot say words, if someone is making you scared and you need someone to know. It had come from a short training video he watched in a break room when the heating was broken and someone had left the station laptop open. The video was clinical and calm, the narrator speaking in steady tones about signs to watch for and what to do. Document, contact mall security, call police if there is immediate danger. It was the kind of thing people nod at in staff meetings and then forget. But for Thomas, the image of a small hand tapping 5 times lodged somewhere under his ribs, like a chord waiting to be played. He did not expect to see it in the polished chaos of the holiday week. It was after 2. The mall smelled of cinnamon and newly bought leather. He was in the corridor near the children's apparel store when he saw the girl, no more than 7, maybe 8, standing a step behind a woman in a coat too dark for the bright lights. The woman moved through the crowd with an easy, practiced sweep of her arm as if she owned the space. The girl stayed tight to her side, eyes lowered, sneakers scuffing at the tile. At first, Thomas thought she was shy. Kids often were, in crowds. Then his eye caught the small detail that rearranged everything. The little hand lifted, slow, almost apologetic, then tapped an invisible spot on her chest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not a cry, just a quiet, exact repetition. His body did what memory told it to. He froze, mop in mid-sweep. The recorded carol in the speakers seemed distant. The taps repeated, gentle and precise. Thomas felt the old carpenter's instincts. Attend to small things, measure twice, cut once, merge with something harder, a prickle of paternal alarm that refused to be reasoned away. He took in the rest of her. a bruise like a shadow curling near the jaw, a sleeve pulled down too far, knuckles pale from tight gripping, eyes that flitted to the exit as if weighing routes. She did not meet anyone's gaze. When a nearby saleswoman asked her a question, "Do you need help finding the sweater?" the woman at her side answered for her in a voice smooth as cloth, too smooth, and the girl's mouth did not open. The adult's hand closed over the child's shoulder with a firmness that didn't read as affectionate. The signs stacked. Thomas felt the old, cold fear that had lived with him since bills stopped balancing and promises stopped meaning the same thing. He thought of Emma's tiny hand tapping at breakfast when she wanted extra syrup but couldn't say it because she was watching manners at a restaurant. And of the way his little girl had looked at him with trust when he explained the signal, not as a drama, but as a practical thing, like lacing shoes or tying a knot. The lesson had been simple. If a child cannot speak their fear, let small, quiet signs speak for them. He moved closer, pretending to sweep near the bench. His cart rolled just beyond the pair, a harmless trajectory. He watched. The woman laughed at something a man said and kept the child near, her hand loose around the girl's wrist. The child's eyes darted to the ceiling, to the exit, back to the woman. Then she tapped again, 5 lighter taps this time, like a tremor. There was a choice in front of him, clean and raw. Act and risk trouble. His manager had fired people for causing scenes before. Or keep sweeping and keep his job and his rent paid for another month. His breathing narrowed. He thought of the eviction notice, of the time he skipped a week's groceries so Emma could have new shoes for school. He thought of the way being noticed could go either way, expose the truth or get him in trouble for meddling. He remembered a line from the training video, a practical instruction that cut through the panic. Document what you see, notify security, call authorities if immediate danger. He also remembered the way Mr. Peterson, the mall manager, had scowled the last time Thomas had caused a fuss when a toddler wandered near an escalator. Peterson had the kind of authority that liked them all to look like a postcard, clean, safe, and untroubled by complications. Thomas imagined the manager's reaction now. "Tom, do you really have to?" and the cold dismissal that followed. He pushed the cart a little more, positioned himself so he could see without being obvious. He dialed security on his radio, standard channel, courteous code. "Custodial to security, this is Tom on A-Wing. Possible concern near Children's Corner. Can you come by and take a look?" He kept his voice even. The radio crackled. "Copy, Tom, on our way." He hoped it was enough. But nothing was ever simple with the things that mattered. A minute later, a small security guard, Red Blake, arrived. Red because of a mop of hair that had once been shock red and now was 2 shades closer to gray. Red looked like someone who had once wanted to be a cop and then settled for monitoring a mall. He glanced at the trio, then at Thomas. "What's up?" he asked, a professional flatness to his tone. Thomas pointed with the handle of the mop, careful not to make a scene. "The child. She's tapping. Twice I saw the 5 taps." Red's jaw tightened in a way Thomas had learned to read as skepticism. 5 taps? "Like this," Thomas said softly, showing the motion, hand close, fingers tapping the chest. He kept his face calm. He could feel Red watching his hands like they might hold a weapon. Red looked at the woman and the girl and then back at Thomas. Maybe she's play acting. Maybe she wants candy. We can't jump to conclusions. Thomas wanted to say 1,000 things. "You don't know what you're looking at. It's not about jumping, it's about seeing. I taught my daughter this and she would never tap that way unless she needed help." Instead he said, plain, "Just watch her. Don't let them leave the mall." Red glanced nervously toward the main exit, where families streamed past a display of holiday lanterns. He radioed in a casual way, "Keep an eye on A-Wing exit," then left a distance between himself as if to show he hadn't committed. Thomas could have argued, but his position was fragile. He had to balance acting with surviving the paycheck. He moved closer again, this time with a paper towel he pretended to need, a prop. He knelt by a fountain to wring it out, eyes fixed on the pair. He noticed the woman's perfume, cheap and floral, an attempt to mask something sharper, and the child's hand clamped so tight to a plastic doll's head that a hair had been flattened away. Thomas saw a flash of movement toward the south exit. The woman's stride hastened. The child did not walk faster. She became a weight on a string. Thomas radioed again. "Security, A-Wing. They're heading south. Please." His voice was lower now, not an appeal, but a request from a man whose chest had already locked around a single need. Mr. Peterson, the mall manager, found them then, not with the quick stride of an onlooker, but with the slow, measured steps of someone who led from his office and loved order. He was wearing a suit that had been cut to humor his ego and shoes that did not scuff. He arrived with an expression that read, "Someone has interrupted my holiday flow." "What's the problem?" Peterson asked, voice carefully practical. Thomas explained, the words concise. The silent taps, the child's avoidance, the woman who answered for her. Peterson's eyes flicked to the girl, then to the crowd, then down to the paperwork in his hand. "Tom, this is a public place. We don't have room for baseless accusations. Red, are they purchasing? Do they have receipts? We can't detain someone for asking questions." "It's not an accusation," Thomas said, and suddenly his voice had weight. "It's a sign. I taught my daughter this." Peterson's lip curled. "You taught your daughter a what?" "A safety signal. It's a way for a child who can't speak to ask for help. 5 taps. Thomas showed it again, slow, deliberate. He saw a dozen heads tilt. Curiosity is a dangerous habit in a mall. Peterson frowned, as if there were reasons this needed a policy review. "This isn't the place for theatrics, Thomas. We want our shoppers to feel safe. If you cause a scene, I'll have to—" He did not finish the threat, but his posture finished it for him. The implication was clear. Cause trouble, and you lose the job that keeps you from losing more. Thomas felt the old shame, like a cut reopening. He thought of Emma's face if he came home fired. He imagined winter without a furnace, of ramen packets stretched into dinners for weeks. He also held, very easily and very clearly, the small hand that had tapped 5 times. The moral choice compressed into a point: risk being dismissed and keep hoping, or risk losing what he had to gain what no single paycheck could buy. He moved before he could parse the future properly. He stood up, his mop clattering, and the sound made half the people turn. He walked with a steadiness he did not feel. "Let me just talk to her," he said. "I won't make a scene." Peterson's face threaded between annoyance and the gleam of a man who thought rules had to be enforced to keep his kingdom tidy. "You can't detain people," he said. "We call security. You call the police if you think." "I already called security," Thomas said. "Red's here. I'm not a threat." The woman looked over her shoulder then, and for a beat her face was ordinary in every way. She smiled at a passerby, practiced and warm. Then the little girl, Lily, Thomas thought the name might be Lily, though he did not know and he would not find out for a while, tapped once more, as if to remind reality of the thing inside her. It was a quiet thing, so domestic in its volume it could have been a nervous tick. But everyone who knew the code saw it. Thomas, Red, a teenager pushing a stroller, a gift-wrapped clerk at the kiosk. Their chests tightened. Something shifted then in the air. 1,000 small, social calculations flickered like a store display. People who would not have looked suddenly had reasons to. Mothers shushed children. A grandmother slowed her carriage. The woman tightened her grip and increased her pace. The mall's south doors were a sea of movement. Thomas had one chance to stop them before the glass doors opened to the parking lot and to unknown cars, unknown hands, unknown roads. He could wave down more security. He could film with his phone, a small modern witness. He could stand in the doorway and block them and risk the physicality of a confrontation. He chose the human route. He moved so that he cut off the quick path to the exit, and in one motion put himself between them and the glass. He walked up close enough that the woman could hear him. He spoke without shouting, voice low but carried in a way that made a dozen heads turn toward them. Ma'am, excuse me, he said. Does the little girl belong to you? The woman's eyes flashed at him, flat and dangerous. She does, the woman said. Her voice was calm but with an edge that suggested practiced deflection. Mind your business. Thomas kept his gaze steady. He noticed something new. The woman's fingertips, faintly sticky, as if from candy. Thomas's whole body tightened. She seemed, he began, but the woman cut him off. You say that to security, she replied, voice smooth. You make trouble, you'll get people hurt. The words were a threat wrapped in civility. At that, a crowd instinctively recoiled. A few people stepped back, pulling children with them. An older man pushed his cart between himself and Thomas, as if distance could give moral safety. Mr. Peterson hovered, equally displeased and unwilling to be the person who made the mall look unfavorable. Thomas felt the choice again, raw as a winter wind. He could walk away. He could pretend he had misread a scene and live with the question in his belly forever. He could let the payroll hold him down. He could keep sweeping and breathe. Instead, he said the thing he had practiced in 1,000 small internal sermons. You are not going to threaten a child in front of me, he said, steady, and then more quietly to the woman alone. She's asking for help. The woman's face went hard. She pushed the child forward roughly, as if to create distance. Leave us, she told Thomas. Security. Red stepped forward at that point, now no longer able to pretend to be neutral. Ma'am, we need to... But before Red could do anything more, the woman moved quickly, too quick for the crowd's reaction. She shoved the child toward an opening, past a display of decorative scarves, and in the motion, something small and sudden happened. The child's shoe scraped on tile, a sound like a breath. The little girl looked at Thomas as if pleading, and tapped 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so faint it could have been swallowed by the caroler's recorded hymn. It was the moment everything became audible. Thomas lunged. He does not remember the mechanics later as cleanly as he remembers the feeling. Adrenaline folding space, the mop clattering to the floor, the scrape of shoes. He moved and people moved like blanks in the background of his life. He grabbed the child's arm with a careful hand, the way he had taught Emma to hold when crossing the road, firm, not painful. The woman spun and tried to yank the child back. Her fingernails dug into the small arm. The color in the child's face flared as if all the air had been vacuumed from lungs. Hey! Someone shouted. A ripple of sound ran through the crowd. Phones came up. A man in a leather jacket shoved himself between them. Another bystander blocked the woman's path. For the first seconds, it looked like a slow-motion film. Faces, gestures, the woman trying to pull, Thomas anchoring the child with both hands, the child wriggling like a bird caught in twine. Then a louder voice cut through everything. Police! Red barked into his radio, higher this time. We need backup at South Entrance, possible abduction in progress. The woman looked over her shoulder at the sea of witnesses. Her mouth opened into something not quite panic, but not composure either. She pushed, harder. Thomas felt the world narrow to the size of the child in his arms and the woman at his back. The child's fingers were wet on his cuff. She breathed in jagged, small pulls. Someone shouted for Mr. Peterson to call the police. Peterson barked orders that had the sound of a man trying to stitch normalcy into a suddenly ragged seam. He had a clipboard in his hands that looked absurdly useless now. Someone hold the doors, he said. Nobody leaves. The woman moved again, pushing past a mother with a baby stroller. A hand found the child's head and smoothed hair back, as if to reassure, from the child's side, not the woman's side. That hand belonged to a woman from the kiosk who now seemed to remember housekeeping etiquette less than the face of something true and raw. Another person, an older man, wrapped his arms around the woman's shoulder in an attempt to restrain her. The woman bit a cry back, not from sorrow, but fury. Thomas heard himself say the girl's name when he had no right to. "Hey, what's your name?" he asked, soft as the mop bristles. And when the child could not speak, he felt the smallness of it. So many things children cannot say. The child's jaw worked. Tears came, slow and bright. She tapped again, 5 taps that carried through the noise like a bell. People around them leaned in, as if space could be contracted around consequence to make it visible. A man filming with his phone whispered, "Call 911," and everyone's attention snapped, as if a caster had been flicked on. It was then that the first blue lights appeared outside the glass. 2 squad cars slowing in the lot, lights spinning like blue stars under the gray sky. Someone had called. Someone had kept calling. Red stayed with the woman and the child and Thomas, trying to keep hands from flaring and emotions from breaking the moment into chaos. The woman's calm crumpled in the face of the law's approach and a growing crowd. She glanced at the doors and then at the child, calculation and panic dueling across her face. Her arms went tight again, and to Thomas she seemed suddenly very small for someone who had been trying to command the scene. "Put the child down," someone ordered. The voice was unyielding, and from the doorway, police now entered, uniform edging their way between shoppers and displays. A detective stepped forward, the kind of woman whose posture announced competence. Detective Sarah Hayes, the badge read. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to reading faces under stress. She looked at Thomas, at the child, at the woman, and then back to the mall manager with the economy of gestures. "We'll take statements," she said. Her voice carried authority and permission. It was the kind of voice that lets frightened people breathe again. Thomas felt the heavy exhale of a man who had been holding for too long. He unclasped his hands from the child slowly, like setting down something fragile, and the little girl folded into an assistant's arms. Someone wrapped a fleece blanket around her shoulders. The crowd's hum did not go away. Phones, whispers, a woman crying quietly. But the slice of air around them grew stiller as professionals began to separate truth from rumor. The woman, Dana Voss, someone later would tell him, a name pressed into a report, had words to offer that tried to sound ordinary. She told a story about being a distant relative, about errands and babysitting, an acquaintance's short favor. Her voice had the practiced cadence of someone used to being believed, but her eyes darted and her hands were not steady. Detective Hayes watched without flinching. She asked questions that cut into script. Why did the child not answer for herself? Why did you not let her speak? Who else were you meeting? Thomas watched as the practical machinery of law and civics unfolded. Statements taken, a formal request to walk back through certain routes, the mall manager answering for policies, Red giving his version that had gone from skeptical to firm in minutes. The little girl sat with someone from the mall's crisis team, and a paramedic approached to check her, to make sure bruises and shock were attended to. The paramedic's hands were professional, warm. The child's face, when she finally looked up, was jagged with the kind of relief that comes when a danger becomes contained enough to be named. Thomas walked away from the pile of mop residue on the floor like a man in a dream. He felt the eyes of the mall on him, some curious, some resentful, some grateful. And he realized that in the space of one breath, the point where he was invisible had moved. He had been a background instrument of shine and sanitation. For the first time, people looked at him as if he might be a person who moves the gears of protection. Mr. Peterson was not pleased. "You caused a scene," he said later, once the police had the woman in custody and had asked witnesses to wait. His voice held the same clipped quality, but now there was a tremor in it, the nervousness of a man who realized the consequence of letting a child leave during the busiest hour. "You understand, this could have been handled differently." Thomas's answer was simple and small. "She tapped 5 times," he said. "She asked for help." Peterson's eyes narrowed, as if to measure whether he condemned a man or commended a hero. He could not decide which would fix the bottom line faster. Red stood by, no longer skeptical. He had watched the child breathe under the blanket and had heard the call come in to the precinct. "You did what you could," he said to Thomas, rough as gravel and as honest as the uniform permitted. Detective Hayes moved through the noise, her notebook a thin blade through the chatter. She asked questions with a lawful tenderness, not the kind of pity that softens steel, but the kind that makes fact safe to tell. "Where were you when you saw the taps?" she asked. "How many times did she tap? Did you see anyone else nearby? Can you describe the woman?" Thomas answered, and his voice was the one he used to read bedtime stories and to talk Emma through thunderstorms. He described the taps, the sequence in his chest that had told him to act. He told her about the training he'd seen in the break room, about teaching his daughter something simple so she could speak when she couldn't use words. Detective Hayes listened, then wrote something down with a neatness that made paperwork seem like a map. "You did the right thing," she said, not as eulogy, but as a confirmation he could put inside his pockets. "You helped save a child." He felt gratitude then, but it was braided through with something else, a nervousness that this would change everything and nothing. He thought of Emma waiting at home, and of the awkwardness of being told you had done a brave thing for which the community might now expect more of you than you had the time, the money, or the comfort to give. "The child, Lily," the EMT said as she checked a name tag tucked into a coat, "was taken to a quiet room where someone wrapped crayons and paper in a soft bundle, and a social worker sat down to talk gently. Thomas stayed long enough to see her tucked into a chair, her small fingers tracing a blanket hem. She looked up when he stood there and mouthed something he didn't catch. She clasped his hand for a moment, and the touch was both thank you and a brand of sorrow that did not belong to his family, but had landed there like a message." The woman, escorted politely but firmly by 2 officers, kept her jaw set. She did not meet Thomas's eyes. The crowd shifted into murmurs that would, by evening, spiral into a local headline. "Janitor's quick action may have prevented kidnapping." Someone posted a shaky video that caught the last tap, and within minutes, the clip started its slow, viral crawl through feeds. Thomas let the moment happen around him. He answered the officer's questions, then the detective's. He gave his name, his work schedule, his phone number. He gave one more item that felt necessary and practical: the name of the video he had seen, what he had typed into a search bar months ago, desperate and late at night, and the exact description of the hand movement and the 5 taps. Detective Hayes wrote it down, nodded. For a moment he felt useful in the kind of way that was not tied to wages or a pay stub, but to the muscle that held a community's vulnerable parts. Phones buzzed in his pocket like small alarms. He had not meant to become a person whose actions made headlines. But the mall was a small microcosm of the city, and the city likes stories where invisible people become visible. A nurse came up and put a hand on his forearm. "Thank you," she said, low and without show. He wanted to say, "It's nothing," but he couldn't find that voice. What he did find instead was a hope so raw it might have been fear. What if this was not an isolated incident? What if the woman's calm and practiced assertion was the end of a pattern rather than the cap of an example? The detective's phone vibrated in her palm. She read a line on the display, and her face, always steady, pulled into a new shape. Concentration, surprise, the tight smile of someone who had found a thread. She folded her notebook closed and looked at Thomas with something like a professional invitation. "We need to talk to you more," she said. Her eyes were the same color as the squad car light, and they were not unkind. "For now, we're going to take your statement, and we'll need your contact. You might be asked to help identify anything you remember." Thomas nodded, and the gravity landed in him. This was not over. The immediate danger was contained. The woman had been stopped, witnesses corralled. But the ripple felt as if it had hit a larger surface. Phones buzzed in his pocket like small alarms. He had not meant to become a person whose actions made headlines. But the mall was a small microcosm of the city, and the city likes stories where invisible people become visible. A nurse came up and put a hand on his forearm. "Thank you," she said, low and without show. He wanted to say, "It's nothing," but he couldn't find that voice. What he did find instead was a hope so raw it might have been fear. What if this was not an isolated incident? What if the woman's calm and practiced assertion was the end of a pattern rather than the cap of an example? The detective's phone vibrated in her palm. She read a line on the display, and her face, always steady, pulled into a new shape. Concentration, surprise, the tight smile of someone who had found a thread. She folded her notebook closed and looked at Thomas with something like a professional invitation. "We need to talk to you more," she said. Her eyes were the same color as the squad car light, and they were not unkind. "For now, we're going to take your statement, and we'll need your contact. You might be asked to help identify anything you remember." Thomas nodded, and the gravity landed in him. This was not over. The immediate danger was contained. The woman had been stopped, witnesses corralled. But the ripple felt as if it had hit a larger surface.
There was an ache of curiosity and the cold prick of dread that maybe his little private lesson, that tapped code, might be needed again and again. He thought of Emma and the way she practiced her geometry homework at the kitchen table, of the syrup smile on pancakes, of the smallest crayon drawing pinned to the wall. He thought of the drawing he'd made with her that morning, a house with 2 windows, and the way she had added 5 tiny dots around the door for reasons she called decorations. He smiled at the memory, painful and glad. A reporter pushed through the crowd toward the offices, eager in a way that smelled like publicity. Someone wanted a quote. Thomas, who had never been comfortable with attention, felt the old instincts to retreat. Detective Hayes gave him a look that was kind and firm. "If you'd like, we can have an officer escort you to your car," she offered. "After that, we'll be in touch." He said nothing for a long beat. Then he remembered Emma waiting at home for the mashed potatoes he had promised that night. He had to go home. He had to put the day into a pocket and fit it into the ordinary shape of life. He had to tell his daughter, not in a way that weaponized fear, but in a way that fortified, a careful, quiet lesson. As he walked to his mop cart and started the slow ritual of collecting the night's debris, he felt less invisible than he had all morning. People thanked him with small, awkward nods. A child tugged at his sleeve and offered a broken holiday sticker in gratitude. A woman from the kiosk handed him a hot cocoa. He accepted, thumb worrying the rim, feeling the sugar crawl into his chest like a small comfort. He did not yet know what the next day would bring. He did not know whether the story would fade into a well-meaning headline or ignite a broader search that would reveal other children in other places. He only knew that a simple, silent signal had been used in a place of noise, and that a man who had been content to be background had chosen to answer it. He wheeled his cart toward the employee exit where the lot awaited, and the November air was a sting and a promise. The mall behind him hummed, lights, music, commerce, unchanged in its daily purpose. But he walked out with something shifted inside, a sense that being seen was not only about being visible to others, but choosing when to be visible for the sake of someone else. Outside, snow began to flurry, in small, polite drifts, catching in his lashes. He thought of the 5 taps as if they were a small mechanical code that once in the world could change patterns. He knew, too, that the code had to be taught carefully. No terror, no weaponization, just a practical tool for quiet calls in loud places. He pressed the button on his car key and the remote chirped. Someone on the sidewalk stopped and asked quietly, "Are you the janitor?" He nodded. The person's eyes reflected a kind of incredulous gratitude that still surprised Thomas. "You saved a kid today," they said. He shrugged, small and human. "I did what I had to," he said. He felt the words like a compass. He also felt a tug in his chest, a professional curiosity that would not let him sleep easily. How many others might be suffering in plain sight? How many other tiny hands might one day tap 5 times, waiting for someone to refuse to look away? The cruiser's radio in the distance sounded like a metronome. Thomas slid into his car, fingers stained with cleaning solvents and hope. He drove through the lot and onto the street toward home. At a red light, he stopped and, without quite meaning to, reached for his phone. He typed a short message to a break room group he and the other custodial staff used for scheduling. Remember the signal. Look out for the taps. And he added, because a small bit of utility seemed necessary, the hotline number that had been on the poster near security the day he'd first watched the training. He typed it without flourish. National Human Trafficking Hotline 1-888-373-7888. Send. The message flared out of his life into the ether, a small intention cast forward. He thought of Emma arranging her stuffed animals for bed, of the purple crayon house on the fridge, of the way a father's small lessons can turn into someone else's lifeline. He breathed in the winter air and let it go, slowly, as if rehearsing how he might tell the story without making his daughter afraid. On his way home, the news alert blinked on his screen. Local janitor intervenes in possible abduction at Riverside Mall. He glanced at it and felt the same mixture of embarrassment and relief that comes when private acts of courage become public currency. He took the next right toward the street that led to their apartment building. He thought again and again of the tapping hand and the quiet calculus that had compelled him to stand up. He kept thinking of how small, ordinary choices, like teaching a signal, like refusing to look away, had the power to shift someone's fate. When he pulled into the parking lot and saw the familiar shadowed cutout of their building, he slowed. There was time before Emma's school bus route would reach them. He'd tell her the story tonight in a way that was steady and certain and unalarming. He had to make sense of the day for her, to place it into the kind of moral geography children can navigate. Someone needs help, we do what we can. His phone buzzed again. Detective Hayes's number flashed across the screen. He let it ring. He was not ready to be pulled into anything more tonight. There would be paperwork and statements, interviews, and maybe cameras. And there would be people who wanted to hold him up as a symbol of courage. He did not know if he wanted the attention. He only knew what he had done and why. He sat for a long, full minute with his hands on the steering wheel, feeling the warmth of the car bleed into his palms and the cold of the evening crawl at the edges of his jacket. His mind returned again to the little hand that had tapped 5 times and to the way it had summoned him. He pictured the child safe, wrapped in a blanket, coloring with a crayon. He pictured his daughter's face when he told her the outcome. Then he stepped out into the air and walked toward the building where everything ordinary waited: dinner, homework, the secret smallness of their days, and toward a night where he would practice the next quiet lesson, the one that lived in habits, vigilance, kindness, and the courage to be seen when someone else needs you to be. The phone vibrated on the dash until Thomas finally answered. Detective Sarah Hayes's voice was steady on the line, the same calm competence he'd heard through the mall noise. "Tom, can you come down to the station in the morning? We're following up on leads, and I'd like you to be available." She didn't ask, she offered the clarity of a plan. He promised he'd be there. Before the night closed in, he told Emma the smallest version of what had happened. A girl had tapped, he'd helped, everyone was okay. He left out the police procedures, the press, the way a stranger's look had waited for him to fail. He tucked his daughter into bed, smoothed the blanket over her shoulder, and watched her thumb graze the stuffed bear's threadbare ear. He did what he always did, to hold fear in a safe place. He made pancakes in the morning, he kissed scraped knees, he taught the small, ordinary things that make a home. The next morning, the station smelled of coffee and the paper scrape of case files. Detective Hayes greeted him in a corridor that smelled of institutional bleach and determination. She led him to a bullpen where several officers huddled around monitors showing a grainy loop of mall entrances and parking lot footage. "We traced her," she said without preamble, "from the mall door cameras to the lot. A tip came in overnight. Someone saw a van with this description. We pulled more cams. It placed this woman near a storage complex on the east side 2 days ago." The video played in a loop,
A van turning at a corner, a figure carrying a duffel, boots against gravel. It was the kind of evidence that could look like nothing on its own and become everything when stitched together with witness accounts. Detective Hayes slid a mug across the table to him. "We're getting a warrant for a storage facility tied to a lease under an alias. We want to move fast." Her eyes sought his hands, calloused, honest. "Would you be willing to come with us? We don't need you in a tactical role, but you were the one who connected the dots in the mall. Your presence can help us with any children we find." Thomas hesitated only the span of a breath. He thought of Emma, the rhythm of her life he couldn't break for the sake of adrenaline. Then he thought of Lily's small hand tapping 5 times against her chest. And the line between staying safe and doing what mattered narrowed until it was simply clear.
"I'll come," he said. Planning was precise and professional. Detectives coordinated with a judge, a prosecutor, and a tactical unit for a raid. Hayes briefed Thomas on how the operation would proceed: a lawful entry, a sweep by trained officers, medical staff on standby, social workers ready to separate children from the shock of rescue and move them into care. "You will stay in the non-tactical area," she told him, "and, if children are found, we'll ask you to be there to help them adjust. Kids respond to normal people. They respond to someone who isn't a stranger in a uniform." She squeezed his shoulder in a brief human gesture, like a book closing on a page. They drove out together in an unmarked car past strip malls and warehouses, the city pulling away from its polished center into the edges where commerce becomes storage and faces often blend into anonymity. Thomas kept to the window, practicing the same calm he used when he read bedtime stories. He wanted to be a steady presence for whatever came. The warehouse was a squat place off a 2-lane road. No lights, no signs, the kind of building meant to be overlooked. Officers moved like a choreography they had practiced under fluorescent colors for years. Silent signals, brief hand motions, a unit moving to seal exits. The judge's warrant was taped to the main door, and then the breach was professional and quick, the kind of motion where years of procedure meet cold urgency. They found children in rooms set up like temporary sleep quarters and in corners draped with blankets. Some were the age of Lily, others older. Faces hollowed by fear rather than by malnutrition, eyes flickering away from bright lights. There were bolted doors, a few locks stripped of dignity rather than bones, and rooms that smelled of stale air and fear, an odor that pressed against Thomas like gravity. Detectives moved through the rooms in pairs, officers calling loudly to establish order, medical techs moving in to check for immediate physical needs. Hayes signaled Thomas forward when her team reached a small room where 3 children sat close together on a threadbare mattress. One child clutched a stuffed rabbit, a thin ribbon tied around its neck. Their hands tapped, not in code, but in nervous motions that mimicked habit. Thomas crouched slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice quiet. He did what he'd done in 100 mundane moments. He introduced himself like an ordinary neighbor, not a knight or a rescuer. "Hi," he said, "I'm Tom. I work at a mall." He didn't lie. He simply offered a role that wrapped in the reliability of someone who cleaned floors and knew how to mend a ripped hem. He spoke about pancakes, about the way syrup makes little islands on a plate. He asked no invasive questions. He let silence be permission for trust. Children's eyes roamed toward him like small boats to a light. One little boy, no more than 6, pushed a strand of hair from his face and whispered that he liked trains.
Another child named a city he recognized from a picture book. The eldest, whose jaw had set like a young man, watched with guarded curiosity. Thomas handed each child a Raft granola bar from his work bag and a small sticker he had saved from a store. Random resignations that felt like currency. He stayed while officers cataloged items and Hayes coordinated. Social workers began establishing names, ages, immediate family contacts. No one in that room seemed eager to speak of what brought them there. Their immediate priority was to find something ordinary. An adult who would hold a hand and not ask for details too soon. Outside the warehouse, the press waited like a title rumor. When the news broke, it painted quick strokes. Children rescued in East Warehouse raid. Local janitor helps in raid. But those headlines condensed months of work into a single frame. Thomas's name appeared in those frames because someone's shaky phone caught a moment where he knelt and offered a blanket. The viral clip that would later circulate showed him smiling gently as a child, eyes wide, accepted a sticker and a granola bar. No one in that clip knew the weight behind his hands. For days, the city swelled with practical compassion. Interviews multiplied in careful, controlled settings. Parents, those who could be located quickly, arrived at precincts with members of the investigative team to reclaim the children they had lost for reasons that ranged from calculated deception to desperate attempts at survival. Jennifer and Michael were among the first to identify themselves as Lily's parents. They arrived at the station, first awkward, then raw. Their reunion with their daughter was not a cinematic climax, but a trembling, protracted relief. Michael's arms shaking as he held his child. Jennifer pressing a forehead to a small crown of hair and weeping with a sound that held both recrimination and thanksgiving. The reunion had the soft, awkward endings of human restoration. Whispered apologies, a mother's touch that tried to return time to something that couldn't be changed. Thomas watched from a distance as the family became whole again in the simplest sense. He stayed to give a longer statement about the taps, to tell detectives what he'd seen, and to provide his contact if anything else came up. Detectives continued to build the case against Dana Voss, her name appearing in reports and in the official narrative as a person tied to a pattern of trafficking activity. The legal process moved forward in fits and starts. Charges filed, bail hearings, evidence logs. Thomas could not and would not speak to the finality of any sentence. The system had to do its work. There were practical follow-ups too. Social services arranged longer-term care and therapy for children who had been rescued. Shelters opened their doors. Nurses conducted medical checks with the clinical tenderness of professionals who had trained to turn immediate shock into a stabilizing regimen. He explained the simple steps to take if a child uses the signal. Keep calm, document what you see, notify security, call law enforcement if needed, and provide the child with immediate safety and reassurance. He taught people what signs often accompanied the signal: a child avoiding eye contact, an adult answering for the child, a frightened or hectic posture, clothing that didn't match the season, a child being kept physically close. He did not promise the signal would always work. He promised only that training and attention could create more chances. 2 months into the program's rollout, David's resources funded free training in 3 public schools and a pilot with several retailers. The classes had a modest, hopeful quality. Parents brought cookies, teachers took notes. Children practiced saying the signal's name like a new word learned in gym class. For Thomas, the work was less about accolades and more about architecture, building a small, strong framework that might protect more small lives. And then it happened, twice more. The first, a clerk in a small suburban boutique, recognized the sequence of taps under a flurried scarf. The clerk used calmer steps. She stepped toward the child, offered a brochure, radioed security, and called the local police. The child was rescued. The action was traced back to training videos and a short message posted by the boutique after they enrolled in Thomas's session. The second instance occurred when a school crossing guard, who had attended a parent meeting where Thomas spoke months earlier, noticed a child's anxious motion at a bus stop. She diffused the situation quietly and called police. The child was taken to safety. In both cases, the headlines were smaller, the consequences intimate. 2 more children who were given options where they had none. Thomas never let the small victories swell into self-congratulation. He knew the work had limits. He spoke often of complexity in staff meetings. Trafficking was not a single villain acting alone. It was a network of choice, neglect, and opportunity exploited by those who preyed on vulnerability. He insisted on the dignity of survivors and on the importance of therapy, medical care, and long-term support. He pushed David's nonprofit to fund counseling and family reunification services, to help fund housing for families who could not afford to retrieve their children immediately, to build networks that did not let rescues evaporate into bureaucratic limbo. At home, the life he and Emma shared threaded back into its rhythms. They moved into a modest, brighter apartment, 2 rooms more than the last, and the first small grace came in the form of a used bookshelf that someone from the nonprofit donated. The move was practical: better schools, closer to the community center where Thomas taught. Emma liked the new light in the kitchen. She loved the small patch of carpet where she could lay out her crayons. She asked questions about his work carefully, as if testing the truth of it. He taught her the difference between being aware and being afraid. "We're doing the same thing we've always done," he told her one evening. "We're being kind and paying attention." She nodded like a child who knows the world in increments. Word spread slowly and then all at once. The first story that labeled him a janitor hero sat uneasily with him, but he used the attention to press simple things into the public sphere. Training budgets for stores, programs in schools, clear phrasing about signs and steps. He kept saying the same practical things. The signal could be taught without frightening children. It must be paired with reporting procedures, and adults had to practice compassion, not curiosity, when they intervened. Jennifer and Michael became public witnesses at a city council meeting, advocating for better registration of storage facilities and more training for frontline workers. They credited Thomas partially for the chain of events that led to their child's rescue, though they were careful to place gratitude within a larger system of professionals who had worked. They hugged him once, no more and no less than what was needed, and their thanks was the kind that sits between people who have shared a hard thing and come out the other side. Detective Hayes remained a steady presence in the background of his life. They spoke often: notes, a quick coffee, updates on the legal case. "You did something ordinary and important," she told him once, "the kind of recognition that lets a person keep their humility intact while acknowledging consequence. You were visible when someone needed you to be." It was not hero-making, it was notice. Months turned. The case against Dana Voss moved through the wheels of law. Thomas did not attend every hearing. He trusted the detectives to do their job. He knew the court's outcomes would not be measured solely in headlines, but in legal process. He kept insisting to the program that prevention was the long arc of work, not a single rescue, but a steady building of capacity. His public speaking became less about him and more about community. He trained custodial teams, retail managers, school staff, and parent groups. He developed a short pamphlet, a fold-out card with a simple drawing of the hand gesture and 5 dots, a short list of signs to look for, and the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 1-888-373-7888. He carried stacks of the cards in his coat like seeds. On a late spring afternoon, at a community fair where his nonprofit hosted a booth, a woman approached him with a small envelope. Her hands shook. Inside was a photograph of a child reunited with parents, one of the 2 cases his trainings had assisted. The woman had been the crossing guard who had noticed the tap at the bus stop. She had come by to say thank you in private. Thomas felt the same tightening in his chest he'd felt in the mall. The clarity that small acts reverberate. He handed her a sticker and said, "Good job." The woman nodded, and for a second, their lives overlapped like bookends. At night, the invisible tenderness of domestic life resumed its quiet rule. He returned from trainings with stories that were careful and contained. Emma's questions were precise. "Dad, are there more kids who need help?" she asked once, rubbing a crayon between her fingers. He sat beside her on the rug and drew a small house with 2 windows, and then he drew 5 little dots around the door. "We do what we can," he said. "We teach, we watch, we help." He also taught Emma how to avoid letting the signal become a cause of fear. They practiced a script together. What to say if someone asks questions about asking for a signal, how to tell a trusted adult, how to keep certain details private to avoid copying. He wanted her to be prepared, not paranoid. It was the sort of conversation that felt like both armor and a lesson in trust. As the program grew, it adopted other small innovations: a training video that used actors and respectful scenarios, a short curriculum for teachers that integrated the signal into broader safety lessons, and partnerships with retailers that allowed staff to have quick reference cards at registers. David Chen's business contacts helped secure funding for a mobile unit that could bring training to neighborhoods with fewer resources. The program's staff, some former custodial workers, some parent volunteers, a small team of social workers, worked by compromise and caffeine. Thomas managed schedules, created scripts, and led the trainings, but he kept mopping on weekends. Work grounded him. He declined invitations to sensationalized talk shows. He allowed a single profile piece in a magazine that approached the story with the gravity it deserved. In that piece, he was careful with language. He refused to let the narrative become about him alone. He insisted on centering survivors and on providing resources. He made sure every mention included the hotline 1-888-373-7888 and a note that the signal is one tool among many. Years later, the public memory of the mall incident would bide between a headline and a civic lesson. For Thomas, it became a long, steady arc. He traveled to small towns where he taught janitorial staff to be attentive, to busy stores where managers had to balance commerce and care, to parent groups where he modeled how to speak to children without causing fear. He never stopped being a janitor. The title stuck, but it was a role he wore alongside being a father, an advocate, and a reluctant public voice. One evening, as a light rain tinting the city's windows, he and Emma sat at the kitchen table. She had a crayon picture, a house with a garden, and this time 5 tiny dots on the front step. She handed it to him with an easy pride that belonged to a child whose world remained mostly safe. He pinned it to the refrigerator by the purple crayon house they had drawn at the beginning of the story. It was a small altar to the way ordinary things protect ordinary lives. He folded the mail, an envelope from the program with a small grant notice, a note from Hayes with a quick update on a case, and tucked the children's pamphlets into a drawer for the next training. He made pancakes with extra syrup the way his daughter liked. They ate, their laughter softened by routine. The stuffed bear sat on the counter with one button eye watching the room like a patient guardian. Later, when he tucked Emma into bed, she asked, "Do you think we helped a lot of people, Dad?" Her question was the quiet moral ledger children understand. How many good deeds tip a balance toward safety? He kissed her forehead, felt the warmth of a pulse under the hair. "We helped some," he said, and it was the truth. He had seen one signal answered in a mall. He had been part of a raid that freed children from a place they should never have known. He had helped train people who later rescued others. He had moved from invisibility into a role where he could make ordinary decisions that altered outcomes. But he was careful to temper the scale of what he had done with the humility of someone who knew the limits of a good act. "We taught a tool," he said, "and we kept looking." She nodded and fell asleep. He lingered in the doorway, watching the slow rise and fall of a life he'd chosen to protect. In the dim light, he prayed, not in theological terms, but in the small hope that the lessons would travel beyond their city, that children would learn how to say a small private word without fear, that adults would have the courage to notice, that systems would fund rescue and recovery as much as headlines. Before he turned in, he pinned one of the small training cards over the magnetic strip on the refrigerator door, the one with the hand gesture, the 5 taps, and the hotline number. It hung there like a small promise. At the end of the story, the practical takeaways were simple and clear. Learn the hand signal, raise the hand in front of the chest, palm inward, and tap 5 times, and teach it gently to children and caregivers. Watch for signs that often accompany a plea for help. Child avoiding eye contact, adult answering for the child, a frightened or tense posture. If you see the signal, stay calm, document what you see, notify local security or authorities, and call for professional help when necessary. Share this knowledge with someone who cares for children, a neighbor, a teacher, a store clerk. Be the person who notices. If this resonates with you, take a moment to learn the silent signal and consider subscribing to learn more about practical steps anyone can take to keep children safe. Thomas's life did not become an arc of glory. It became a ledger of small, steady behaviors, teaching, noticing, helping, carried out with the dignity of someone who swept floors and mended broken things. He continued to teach, to stand when a small hand tapped, and to remind himself that courage often looked like simply refusing to look away. If you'd like to help spread awareness, teach the signal to one child or caregiver today and share this story. For resources or to report suspicious activity, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. Be vigilant, be kind, and be the person who notices when someone cannot speak for themselves.